But basically, my aim, not only professionally but personally, is trying to establish intercultural bridges, right? Establish bridges between cultures in a way that we all get represented and no one imposes its point of view. So, in that line, I would like to make clear that my intention today is somehow becoming sort of a spokesperson of many European gender scholars that are willing to listen and they're willing to learn from specific particularities, Asia in general, but in this case China, with raw openness and clear heart, which means that being able to be modified and open and change our minds sometimes about what we hear. And so my goal today is, I have a twofold goal. I would like to bring into this cross-cultural academic dialogue that the One Asia embodies, nodal points and junctions of commonality between works of some Chinese academics, especially in the field of gender, and European transversalists and intersectional gender theorists. So why am I talking today about differences and similarities in the discourse of equality between Europe and China? Well, as I said, thanks to this course I've learned so much, but everything started when I was doing my PhD dissertation on the topic of intersectionality. So during my PhD dissertation, I came across these three wonderful women. One of them is Xiana. She's actually native, and the other ones are diasporic women, meaning that they are Chinese descendant, but they were raised and educated in the United States. Because when I was doing my PhD, the concept of intersectionality for my own research, it's a long trajectory first articulated by women of color in the US. Women of color, self-proclaimed women of color, because we all are color. But anyway, it's a way of visibilizing at that time, no? So I first came across Xiana, Xu Mei, and Xiana Wu, and when I was reflecting about women of color. And I have to confess that I was completely stunned, first of all, at my sheer ignorance about Chinese context and Asian context for that matter. I started to investigate a little bit about this, and so I came across two concepts that I would like to kind of share with you and try to decipher with you, because those were the main claims. One was the claim of asymmetrical cosmopolitanism, and the other was the plea of regionalized voices and approaches to equality. So once I understood what they meant with this, it made clear to me that really there was unequal landscapes of discursive relation between European scholars and Chinese scholars, and also I discovered many things in common. And so this is more or less what I would like to share with you. The first case, Xiana, from my point of view, is the most interesting case, because she founded the discipline of women's studies in the city of let's see if I pronounce this well, if someone is Chinese can help me out. Sotelo? No one Chinese here? Okay. And the province of, you? Okay, help me out, please. Okay. Kind of like that. In the province of Henan? Henan, okay. So think about it, 1980s. In Europe, we're still fighting for the institutionalization of women's studies, okay? But she was the founder of women's studies over there. So that was, so she, at the beginning in her early works, she calls herself a feminist with capital letters, okay? Actually, when you look at the first works, for example, I'll say it in English, even though you have it in Chinese. The first of her early works is called An Exploration of Women Aesthetic Consciousness, and it's very interesting because in this work you find a lot of references to what we call Western feminism's canons. For example, there's a lot of reference to the Bronte sisters, There are a lot of references to Sylvia Plath, to Simone de Beauvoir, to Teresa de Lauretis, let's see if I don't forget anyone, Emily Dickinson, Virginia Woolf, Simone was already said, Elaine Solwater, Gilbert and Goober, okay, so a lot of them are there. And then in a beautiful one, that was at the end of the 80s, and then in 1992, she wrote, this is also a very beautiful work, and it's called Women, A Beautiful Distant Legend. And there she beautifully celebrates, through a cross-cultural comparative study, independent, empowered women in myths, in literature, in works of art, in many countries, including Europe. But all of this radically changed when she, due to the publication of her latest book, she was invited to give a talk to Harvard University. And after that talk, she became a vocal defender of irreducible differences between Europe and Asia. Well, Europe, Western feminism, and Asia. Well, what happened? Well, she explains that there were 3 critical questions that were posed by a diasporic Chinese woman named Pi that made her realize of the imperialistic nature of Western feminism. The fact that she was diasporic, that provided even more distress to her, because she was speaking on behalf of Chinese community in the United States when, according to Li, she had no clue of specific particularities of Chinese women. So, in a way, she was claiming that the fact that diasporic women in Europe or in the United States speak on behalf is a way of stealing or appropriating discursive rights of an experience and a particularity that has nothing to do with them. Okay, so within this context, okay, the insistence of feminism as a reaction against sexism, institutionalized sexism, was what she was completely in disagreement. So these are the questions that she was asked. First of all, what is feminism in your understanding? Asking this Western feminist spokesperson to her. Second question, what is Western feminism? And third, what are the differences between what you call particularities of Chinese women movement and Western feminism? She found these questions infuriating because of the fact that she was vocally in disagreement with the idea of feminism as a reaction to state sexism. So, in her words, these questions implied a hidden implication and also a contradiction, in the sense that what these Western women, always between comments, okay, were implying was that what Chinese women call feminism is not considered true feminism, because feminism is a universal category. Now you have to understand that this is the beginning of the 90s, when the intervention of women of color and intersectionality was not still accepted, okay? So there was this big idea, and you can see studying Western feminisms, that, well, there is this plea of universality. So she thought, well, hey, if you ask me what I think is feminism, you are implying that my definition of feminism is not feminism. And so what it's implied is that particularities of Chinese experiences are outside feminism. And that's what she was revolting against. That was she found infuriating. Okay, so that was the first case. Okay, so we have Li Xiaoyin. Then I came across a, let's see if I pronounce that, Xu Meiqi. Okay. In Towards Anesthetics and Ethics of Transnational Encounters, or When Does a Chinese Woman Become a Feminist? So what happened is that she also recalls in this article how, and that was a few years earlier than the incident at Harvard University. That was in 1998. And so she was in this event that was hosted by the Chinese Ministry of Culture. She was acting as a translator of the U.S. Women Writers Delegate, okay? So she was a translator, and well, again, always understand that the context in which these women are rebelling to is the context of this emphasis on feminism as a fight against state patriarchy and male oppression. So within this context, there were some writers there. One of them is Xiana. Are you familiar with her? Well, I've read she was famous. She's a famous Chinese writer, but I don't know a lot of Spanish writers either. So Xiana, she was a famous Chinese writer, and within this context, she was asked whether she thought that Chinese women writers were keen on expressing feminist intent and on visibilizing women oppression. Okay? And she, of course, reacted in the same way as Lee, and that's why Xu Meixi was unable to reply, because she was shocked by her answer. And the answer was, as you have here, she replied with disdain, well, there is no such a thing as feminism in China, and no writer will call herself a feminist, not a feminist writer. Now, this is all crises are great opportunities, right? But in this crisis of completely opacity and division, again, the U.S. women writers were so hurt that they didn't even wanted to listen to the reasons of why they were reacting that way. And basically, as Xu Meixi confesses, what happened there is that the possibility of fructiferous academic exchange between Western and Chinese collapsed into an abyss of misunderstanding and theoretical clashes. It is interesting how she describes what she meant by this, and she said, without acknowledging and studying the history of socialism in China, American writers and I turned the possibility of cultural translation and mutual understanding into an encounter of incommensurability. So what happens is that we are trained to believe they're so different, right? When in the end, it's just lack of ignorance of our historical context. So, interestingly enough, I found the same argument and the same logic in Wu. So Wu, in this article that is called Making Sense of Chinese Feminism and Women's Studies, she also refers to a 1998 interview where famous writers that are considered feminists in Western terms, they voice very clear non-feminist claims. These writers are Angie Wong, I don't know if I'm pronouncing it well, and Qin Dai. Dai or Dai? Qin. Qin Dai, thank you so much. So Angie Wong and Qin Dai, they also voice these non-feminist claims. Qin Dai affirmed, in the context, again, right, that feminism is a fight against state patriarchy, she affirmed that feminism from abroad, meaning feminisms that react to institutionalized sexism, did not resonate with Chinese reality. And of course, the interviewer, who was a US writer, was completely enraged by that, right? I was able to gather some common elements in these three writers. And so what I realized is that what these Li and Xi and Wu had in common was that they all claimed that the failure to account for historical and cultural differences between Europe and China was the most powerful factor contributing to opacity and to instances of incommensurability in cross-cultural academic dialogues about equality. And also, as I said, what they all claim is that in order to avoid misunderstandings and misfire, we need to reach ethics in translatability. This is what they all agree, right? How we reach these ethics. And this is very much in line with the idea that we need to validate specific ways of understanding female oppression beyond mainstream Western model of women's liberation. So she says, it is not that Western feminist has a mistaken notion of difference and similarity, but rather that the Western feminist enjoys the power to arbitrarily conferring difference and similarity in the non-Western woman. She stresses the fact that the Western subject's strongest weapon in practicing this asymmetrical cosmopolitanism is not that he or she denies the non-Western access to cosmopolitanism, but has the power to assume sheer neglect or ignorance in the non-West. Do you understand? And finally, so what is this about arbitrating power? Well, with the power to arbitrate difference and similarity in such reductive terms, the Western subject can simply ignore, which otherwise needs to be learned with time, with effort, with contact, with curiosity, with encounters, you know? And you know, the idea that we need to represent each other in many contexts, not only European mentality. Ironically, in the 17th, as early as the 17th century, and I'm going to do a comparative study of equality between China and Europe, okay? So, ironically, it's in the 17th century, one century earlier, any recorded feminist work in Europe, then we find in China that some women wrote letters to the thanking to these emperors, the Manchu emperors, Shangxi or Shunzi and Kanchi. So they were thanking to them for banning food binding. So in Europe in the 18th century, what is the first documented feminist manifesto? The first one. No, before Mary Wollstonecraft. No, sorry, no, I get emotional. No, okay. Thank you. No, it's not Mary Wollstonecraft.
I think it's the French Manifesto for the Women's Rights along the Solidity. I don't remember.
Exactly, because actually, and I know this goes off topic, but the whole discussion about ciudadanas is not a trending topic, okay? This is something that we've been fighting since the 18th century, okay? When women and men fought together in the French Revolution, together, okay? But once they won the French Revolution, we were expelled out of the social contract, okay? So in 1791, Mary de Gouges wrote the Declaration of the Rights of Women and Citizens just to be civilized that we were left out of the social contract. And then 1 year later, Mary Wollstonecraft, mom of Mary Shelley, right, who wrote the Frankenstein. And so in the 18th century, there is no records in China. And then in the 19th century, what we find is that we find the Seneca Falls Declaration, right? And that was in the US. Then we find John Stuart Miller and in the UK, right? And we find that at that time the suffragettes were mobilizing in the UK and the US. But that at the very same time, there were intellectuals in China, I put it here. Oh yeah. So there were intellectuals in China, especially male intellectuals, who were fighting for women's rights. So, pretty much the same, right? Then, in this time of revolutionary ideas of the 20th century, we find that in the UK they got the vote in 1918. Then in 1920, the 19th Amendment of the US Constitution. In Spain was a decade later, symbolically, and then until the 70s, we didn't go massively to vote. But okay, so the same in the 20th century, in this time of revolutionary ideas, we find there are records that male intellectuals are introducing Western feminist concepts, advocating for women's rights in different spheres such as marriage, reproductive rights, education, and the right to vote. This is important because in the 20th century in China, ideas such as equality between the sexes and women liberation became a buzzword in the discourse of equality. Okay? Before that in Europe, because the vote, let's remember, they were for women over 30 years old and those who have property. So, and also this is important because within this new discourse of equality in China, we find that the promise of legal equality was articulated as a key paradigm to the Chinese project of national and cultural revitalization. Legal equality in Europe has not been achieved yet. We have a 20% breach in our salaries. Okay. So anyway, in the 20th century, they were incorporating this into the fabric. And actually, well, in the 20s, women in Anglo-European context, they felt liberated. They spoke boldly their minds. They took public roads. But the same day, Chinese, female workers in Chinese and Japanese factories, they joined labor unions before there were unions in the United States and Europe. That was later. So they had unions before us, and they demanded better conditions. So, but then, okay, the same, no? First and Second World War completely made us stop, right? It stopped social evolution, social rights. It was a complete backlash, right? The same happened in China because of the Sino-Japanese War, and then the subsequent Chinese Civil War during the 30s and 40s. That was a stop, right? That stopped. So, as we can see from the 17th century till the 20th century, there are more analogies than differences between the discourse of equality. However, everything changed completely in the Maoist era, and that's when Europeans and Chinese paths completely take apart. Why? Why the Maoist era? It really revolutionized the legal status of women before any European women. Why? Because Chinese Communist Party focused on class struggle and revolution. Okay? And because it put an emphasis on that, and remember, since the 19th century, women and men are the same, was already in there, right? But now we have a slogan saying that men and women are the same, and that women can support half of the sky, okay? And not only that, we have the new marriage law in 1950, and we have the Chinese Constitution in 1954, okay? So far before any Europeans. And these two laws, they guarantee equal rights in different social spheres. And also it's important to understand that they had, at that time, 1949, equal pay, equal job. Here, we're still fighting, We're still fighting for that, We're still fighting. They had it. So that meant that they were, by the 1950s, they all accessed the market in high numbers. Before any Europeans, because of the war. Remember, there were then the Depression, and then the role of the women, and remember Rousseau, and all that. And actually, the Maoist Party created an intermediary institution that was called the Women's Federation. It was to make sure that these changes were implemented in all areas, especially in rural areas. Okay, question. Did communist revolution fail or succeed to eradicate many inequalities suffered by Chinese women? Remember, they had legal equality, legal status. However, as Wu says, okay, they were encouraged to enter the marketplace, equal pay, right? However, there was no implementation to help in the domestic or the reproductive, yeah? So Wu actually, brings into the conversation the fact that there was a gap between the official discourse of equality and the real practice. And actually, the ideal of equality before the law was treated with indifference and contempt. So even though we had a legal recognition, right, that's what they were rebelling against, We have legal status. Our government is not sexist. It's not a patriarchy. You understand why they were rebelling against the Western feminism mission? Because of this, we have legal status, so we're not going to react against sexism. However, as things went by, it's unearthed the idea that, well, it was so much more beautiful in theory than in practice, and the marriage law and the constitution were not really brought to all areas in China, because remember that there's a big difference between the rural and the urban. So a lot of women were still in rural areas, were still not treated in the same way. And especially, and this is the key, what happened is that, okay, you equal pay, equal job, right? Yeah, but since we're not helping you with the reproductive, right, there is this idea of the double burden of the domestic work. And a lot of these women also recognized that there was an overwhelming sense of exhaustion among Chinese women. So women were told to work like men in production, but without socio-economic support for their work at home in the productive and reproductive roles. But in China, when you look at the post-Mao's conditions, you realize that it's not like that, because of what they say. Okay, they are liberated legally speaking, but they're not free because they have a double burden. Right? And they're exhausted and they don't have support. You understand? So that's important, because if these feminists who are not open-minded, and they're not feminists then, but those feminists say, okay, so women, so if you are against liberty, you're not a feminist. No, yes, because in my particular condition, they're not synonyms. Yeah? And also, it's important to understand this, and this is what Li, for example, Li, the famous refusal, has also evolved, right, in her articulation of this. And she also confesses that the lack of freedom is precisely one of the most important characteristics of Chinese women liberation. And also, okay, so this lack of freedom, according to Li, right, is due to two main factors. As we have seen, lack of domestic support, and ironically, for a lot of women in Europe, at least for me, there was a forced suppression of femininity and female characteristics during China Cultural Revolution. So for women to be equal to men meant that they had to dress and behave like men. And we had a generation of women growing to be called tomboys, literally like fake boys. Remember, this is not homogeneous, because as I said, there were some rural areas in China where it was not implemented, okay? So they still in their stereotype or in the traditional gender roles, yeah? But you find, yeah? So of course, this is important to see also the commonalities that we have now. So, okay, this idea that equality was guaranteed in terms of legal terms, but not in terms of recognition of your own gender, created somehow a genderless sense of collective identity as the necessary condition to achieve legal equality with men. My conclusions are that as European gender scholars, vision of ethical cross-cultural encounters, they hold many parallelisms with China, right? And we have to look at the things that unite us, not just the things that separate us, right? Because we have so much that unites us. Yeah, as I said, even though the first refusals back in the beginning of the 90s were so vocal against irreducible differences, right now the term feminism is now starting to be used in a manner that it's a lot of junctures of commonalities. I would like you all please live today with this idea. Miscommunications, most of the time in cross-cultural encounters, are not triggered by essential differences, are triggered by our lack of knowledge, by our ignorance of our specific context, you know? And so that's important to avoid miscommunication. We need to shift the position between universalism and allow for diversity and complexity, which is intersectionality. We need to understand those nuances in their history to grasp the knowledge, right? And not to get into a fight. Looking at these similarities can provide a foundation to foster and consolidate cooperation, which is what really matters. And retaining differences and interacting peacefully is the first step towards academics dialogues based on respect and cooperation. I truly believe in that. And I don't know if you have questions.
Thanks, Xiana.